My name's Ann Froschauer, and today we're going to talk a little bit about bats, my very favorite topic. So usually when I tell people that I work with bats, they say something like, "You work with what?" And I say, "I work with bats." And then sometimes people say things like, "Ooh, that's gross." I hope that you all don't think that it's gross, and maybe if you do, by the end of the talk today, you might think a little bit differently about bats. So let's get started. So first I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I do. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm a communications specialist here. Part of my job is to work with scientists, work with the media, work with the public, and that includes people like students, like you guys. And my job is to communicate about wildlife issues. But I also have another job, and at night, oftentimes, I like to work with biologists and scientists on bat research projects. And I also work with outreach organizations to educate people about bats. So basically, I like to think of myself like a wildlife superhero. A little bit about working with bats. So if you're interested in working with bats and you don't know how you might be able to do that, I actually went to college to study natural resources at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. You can study things like biology, ecology, or wildlife management, and there are actually even a few universities around the country that have bat labs that they study bats. So I'll talk a little bit about bats in general, and then if you all have questions, you're welcome to chat them to me. I probably won't get to them to the end because it's hard to talk and keep track of the questions, but you're welcome to type them in as you think about them. So bats worldwide, there are over 1,300 species of bats all around the world. That's a fifth of all the mammal species on Earth. And bats actually live almost every place on Earth, except for in extreme desert and polar regions. So pretty much anywhere you live, there's probably bats where you are. I like to think about bats in the two kind of major groups. There's megabats, which just like their name sounds, are really big bats. And then there's also microbats, which are the smaller little bats. I'm going to focus mostly on the bats here in the US, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the bats around the world just to give you an idea of all the different diversity. The smallest bat in the world is the bumblebee bat. This bat is so tiny, it actually weighs less than a penny, if you can believe that. And this little bat lives in Thailand and Burma. On the other end of the spectrum is the big flying fox, the Malayan flying fox. It's the biggest bat. It has a 6-foot wingspan, and this bat lives in the Philippines. I also think a lot of bats are really cute, and in my opinion, this is the cutest bat. This is a Honduran tent-making bat. And you can see the picture there. The bats are in a group in a tent that they've made. We're looking up from the ground, up underneath into where the bats are. What they've done is chewed along the spine of a leaf and made it collapse down into a little tent, and then they can roost in there. And that way they aren't visible to predators from above. And if you're down below them and looking up, the sunlight filters through the leaf and makes them a little bit greenish in color, so it's harder for predators on the ground to find them also. Bats are really, really beneficial to humans. They're hard at work all around the world. They provide pest control for crops, things that we like to eat, corn, tomatoes, watermelons. They're also really important pollinators. They pollinate plants like avocados and bananas and cashews. And they're really important for dispersing seeds, especially in the tropical regions. They eat that fruit and they fly off, and in their droppings are the seeds, so they help disperse those seeds to keep the forest growing. But most bats in the world eat insects. About 2/3 of the bat species are insect eaters. Other bats eat pollen or fruit and nectar. There are even a few meat-eating bats. They eat things like frogs and fish. And there are actually 3 species of vampire bats. Don't worry, they don't live here in the US. They're all in Latin America, and they do feed on blood. But it's not like you see in a vampire movie. They don't latch onto your neck and suck all your blood out and you turn into a vampire the next day. They actually have 2 very sharp little teeny teeth in the front. They land really quietly and sneak up on a chicken or a pig They make a really small cut, almost like a paper cut if you've ever had one, and then they lick that cut, and they have a special chemical enzyme in their saliva that keeps the blood flowing so that they can drink about 2 tablespoons of blood in a night. I'm going to talk mostly today about insect-eating bats, and that's because most of our bats here in the United States are insect eaters. And they're really, really important. And that's because they're the primary predator of night-flying insects. Some bats specialize in different kinds of insects. So there's bats that really like moths, and there's bats that really like beetles or flies or aquatic insects, but there's also bats that will eat pretty much anything that they come across. And one of the most amazing things to me about bats is they can actually eat up to their body weight in insects a night. That's pretty awesome. So if you wanted to try to eat like a bat, if you were me, I would have to eat about 50 large pizzas in order to eat like a bat in a night. I really like pizza, but I'm not very sure that I could do that. So, and if you don't like pizzas, maybe like hamburgers better, it'd be like eating 500 quarter-pound hamburgers in a night. There's no way I could do that. I'll talk a little bit about what makes bats special. They're the only flying mammal. You've probably heard of some other animals like flying squirrels. Those guys don't actually fly, they glide. So bats are really the only mammals that can fly under their own power. And if you look at this picture, you might see that the bat skeleton, that their hand, their wing is actually really similar to a human hand. So I think that's pretty cool. They also use echolocation to navigate, communicate, and hunt. Because they're the main predator of night-flying insects, they can't really use their eyesight at night to see their prey. So they've evolved this echolocation, which is using sound waves to see in the dark almost. And you know, one really cool thing I think is that there's some cool relationships between bats and some of their prey species. So for example, there's actually some moths that have learned that if they hear an echolocation call that there's a bat and they don't want to get eaten, so those moths will actually try to evade the bat. They might tuck in their wings and drop really quickly to the ground to try to get away from the bats, or there are actually some moths that send back jamming signals to try to confuse the bats. So in response to that, some bats have actually evolved to echolocate more quietly so that the insects can't hear them. And they have to get, their ears then have had to get really big so that they can capture more sound from those really soft echolocation calls. It's a really neat relationship between the bats and their prey. Bats are also really important to science. People study bats for lots of different things. I just thought I'd touch on a few of those here. For example, the military studies bat flight and navigation to try to develop better flying machines like lighter weight materials for airplanes or navigational systems for unmanned automated vehicles and things like that. We also study bats for medicine. You might remember before I was talking about the vampire bats and how they lick the wound that they create, and they have a special enzyme in their saliva to keep that blood flowing. You can see this picture of a little vampire bat feeding on the snout of a pig there, and you can see, maybe see in that picture the bat's little tongue licking that wound it's created to get the blood flowing. Well, the cool thing about that is scientists have been able to find that special enzyme in the vampire bat saliva and make medicine for stroke victims. I'll talk a little bit about bats here in the United States. We have 47 species of bats in the US. That's pretty cool. Most of those are insectivores. They eat bugs, they eat insects, about 90% of the bats. But we do have a couple of fruit, nectar, and pollinating bats down in the southwestern part of the country along the border with Mexico. So if you think about bats and what they might have to do in the winter, because most of them eat insects, what happens in the winter in most places in the US? Maybe not in the warmer parts, but in the colder parts, most of the insects aren't active in the winter. So bats have to figure out how they're going to survive the winter. There's basically 2 life strategies that bats can employ to survive winter when their food isn't available. There's hibernating bats, and those bats mostly hibernate in caves or mines. Those places that they hibernate are called hibernacula, although sometimes bats will hibernate in old buildings or in rock crevices on cliff walls and places like that. While they're hibernating, bats really slow down their body function, so their breathing, their heart rate, and their body temperature to allow them to conserve the fat that they've stored up and live through the winter. It's also likely that while they're hibernating, their immune systems are reduced in function too, and that'll be important in a little bit when I talk about a disease that's impacting bats here in North America. The other way that bats might be able to survive winter is to go somewhere where there is food. So there may not be food where they live in the summer, but if they go farther south where it's a little bit warmer, they might be able to find some food. So some bats actually will just migrate a short distance between their summer roost and somewhere to hibernate in the winter. But there are some bats that migrate long distances to where food is available in the winter. So for example, there's bats that'll migrate down to Mexico and Brazil and even further south. So I'm going to ask you guys a quick question, and you can chat a quick answer. I wanted to see what you guys think the biggest threat to bats is. So I'll wait just a minute if you guys want to make a guess at what you think the biggest threat to bats is. Okay, let's see. Looks like somebody guessed it right at least. The biggest threat to bats is actually people. There are lots and lots of people on the earth, and there are getting to be more and more people all the time. The world's population is now past 7 billion people. And in order to support all those people, we have to have wood to build our houses, we have to have areas cleared to grow crops, and so we're converting a lot of habitat that's really important to bats into habitat for humans. So we're converting land to agriculture for fields for growing food. We are cutting down forests to build roads and buildings. So we're losing a lot of bat habitat. In addition to that, things are happening like our world is warming and we're having more extreme weather events, like things like hurricanes, and that's causing catastrophic loss of some of the natural roosts that bats might use. I mentioned before that sometimes bats will use human buildings. They've become adapted in some places to humans, and sometimes because they don't have any forest habitat, they will take up residence in old buildings or barns, and sometimes people will remove those and then they lose that habitat too. And we're also modifying caves and mines where bats are hibernating and living as well. Pesticides is another big problem, and I see that somebody mentioned that when I asked the question about what are some of the things that are threats to bats. That's a really important one because bats are eating a lot of insects, and we use pesticides to control pests on a lot of our crops. Pesticides are a problem for bats. Bats are mammals like humans. They also have to drink water, so things like pesticides can get into fresh water, and then when the bats drink the water, they're ingesting pesticides. They're also sometimes ingesting pollution from industry, things like mining and burning of fossil fuels creates pollution that can get into the water and can make bats sick. Disturbance is another big problem. So you remember before I was talking a little bit about hibernation, how bats go into hibernation and they slow down all their systems so that they can survive through the winter. Well, if humans go into places where bats are hibernating and it causes the bats to arouse, to wake up from their hibernation, that burns up a lot of fat. So actually just having to wake up one extra time while they're hibernating can burn up to 30 days worth of their fat storage. So it can really cause them to not have enough fat to live through the winter. Wind energy is another threat to bats. It's really, really important that we figure out some ways to have sustainable energy production in our country. But wind turbines that produce wind energy can be dangerous for bats and birds. The good news is, using science, we can figure out how to adapt our wind energy, our turbines, so that they're not impacting bats and birds as much. I wanted to talk a little bit about this disease called white nose syndrome that's affecting hibernating bats around the country. And you can see here, these pictures are kind of sad. The picture on the right of the bat, you can see that it's got white fuzzy stuff growing on its face and its wings and its ears. That's what gave this disease its name, that white fuzzy fungus. The picture on the left is really sad. That's, if you can see, that's a lot of bats that have died in their cave and they fell down on the floor of the cave. So this disease is actually only affecting hibernating bats. So those bats that fly south for winter, those kinds of bats are not being impacted by this disease. And the disease is actually caused by a fungus. The fungus is a cold-loving fungus, so it only really grows between about 41 and 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Does anybody know what our body temperature is? Our body temperature is about 98.6 degrees, right? Good guess. And bats have a similar body temperature while they're active, but when they go into hibernation, they tend to lower their body temperature around 50 to 55 degrees. So that's right in that area where that fungus likes to grow. This disease has really high mortality rates. Sometimes it's killing up to 100% of the bats in a cave or a mine. It's affecting lots of different kinds of bats, and even though it's really bad and it's affecting a lot of bats, it's not a threat to humans or our pets or our livestock or anything, other animals that we know of. And the way that this disease works, and some of you may have talked about the disease triangle in school, or maybe you will in a couple of years in school, is that you need a host, that's the bats, you need a pathogen, that's the fungus, and you need an environment that supports that, and that's caves or mines. So I'll talk a little bit about that fungus first. It's actually new to science. We didn't even know about this fungus until bats started getting sick. Like I said, it grows at those cold temperatures, and it actually grows, even though it looks like it's growing on the surface, that fungus is growing down deep into the skin of the bats. And it's disrupting their blood flow and their body temperature regulation and things like that. The fungus is called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, and it's actually been found in Europe and Asia. And the bats there don't seem to be affected by the fungus. They don't seem to die from the disease white nose syndrome. Talk a little bit about the environment. Caves. Most of these hibernating bats are using caves and mines. So if you look at this map, the red spots are places where there are a lot of caves and mines. And then on top of that is the yellow, or the counties where we found white nose syndrome. So you can see that those counties and the places where bats are sick with white nose syndrome is a lot of the places where there's caves and mines. So if you look at the western part of the United States, you can see there's lots of caves and mines in the western U.S. too. I'll talk a little bit about where the disease is, but it's likely that this disease is going to spread more across the country. And finally, that host, we'll talk a little bit about the bats that have been confirmed with white nose syndrome. If you remember, we have about 47 species of bats in the U.S. And right now, we have 9 different species of bats that are affected by the disease. So how does this disease spread? Well, mostly bats are spreading it amongst themselves. The picture on the right is a map, and in the center you'll see there's like a little circle. That's actually a cave in Vermont that used to be the biggest bat hibernacula in the Northeast. And all those little lines are bats that have gone somewhere else after they've left the cave. So scientists put some bands on the bats, and they captured them later in the year after they were out of hibernation and they were out feeding. And you can see that the bats from that cave went pretty far away from that cave. So they could come in contact with bats from other caves, and then they can spread that fungus among themselves. But it's also possible that people can spread that fungus. So scientists going into caves and mines, or people exploring caves, could potentially get that fungus on their shoes or their backpacks or their clothing. And then if they go in another cave, they can move that fungus with them to another site. So here's a map of where the disease is in the United States and Canada. This is the map from last year, and you can see that it's mostly in the eastern U.S., although last year it started spreading into Texas. And you'll see we even have white nose syndrome in Washington State. That's where I live. This is pretty close to where I live, the county that the disease was found in, Washington State. So it's continuing to spread across the country, and so it'll be affecting a lot more bats in the future. Once it gets into a cave or mine, it really kills a lot of the bats. So you can see this is a graph showing on the left, you can see the populations before white nose syndrome, and then towards the right of the graph, you can see what happens after white nose syndrome has arrived in those caves. And you can see that those populations have just really crashed. And this is in New York. Just to show you what that looks like, these are hibernating Indiana bats, and Indiana bats are a little bat. If you had a shoebox, you could fit about 300 hibernating Indiana bats in it. So these pictures are probably thousands of bats, hibernating bats, and you can see bats do like to go back to the same place every year, and they even like to go to a specific spot. I see somebody asked if bats like to return to the same place. Yes, they do. And even so much that they might have a special spot in that cave that they go to. So you can see what's happened in this cave to this colony of bats. 2005 is before the disease. 2007 is right around when the disease was discovered. And then 2010 and 11, you can see that that bat population in that cave has really been affected by this disease. And that cave I mentioned earlier when I was showing the map of where bats can go, I actually went to a cave, this cave, it's called Mount Aeolus Cave in Vermont. And it used to have about 300,000 bats in it. And the first room you walk into actually would have 1,000 to 3,000 bats. And I went there in 2010 to do some research, and it was really sad because there were actually only 35 bats left in that room that year. And I took some of these pictures. You can see the little tiny bat skulls and bones on the floor in the cave, and it was really sad that so many bats had died from this disease. And unfortunately, scientists have been looking at what could happen to bat populations because of this disease, and they're finding that actually several species of bats could possibly even go extinct if we don't figure out how to conserve bat species and address this disease. So what would happen if we lost all these bats? Well, remember that bats are the primary predator of those night-flying insects, and that includes lots of crop and forest pests. So that could possibly cost farmers billions of dollars annually. They just did a recent study, and they found that in the U.S., for corn crops alone, bats probably save farmers about $1 billion a year, just in the pest control services that they provide by eating all those insects that would otherwise perhaps be feeding on those corn plants. It could also impact our forest product industries, so places where trees are grown and harvested to produce things like paper and wood. We could be losing that pest control service that bats are providing there too. And it could also have some effects on our human health and other parts of our environment, because we might have to start using additional pesticides to address all those insects that aren't getting eaten by bats. Hibernating bats are also a really important part of caves. There's lots of life in caves, even if you can't see it from the surface. And bats are really important because they bring a lot of nutrients into the cave system. And then just in general, we have 47 species of bats. Over half of those are hibernating bats. We could potentially lose some of those species, and that just reduces our species diversity in the U.S., which really could disrupt just our environmental health altogether. So what are we going to do about it? Well, there's actually a really good news there. There's a lot of scientists and agencies from the states and the federal government and universities all working together to try to figure out this disease and possibly how we might provide treatments for bats and things like that. So we're all working really well together. We're doing a lot of research. We're trying to reduce the possible risk that people could spread the fungus around through things like decontamination. So if somebody is going to go in a cave to do some research. We want to make sure they're not accidentally moving it around. We're trying to reduce those disturbances to bats that might be hibernating. So making sure people know not to go in caves when bats are hibernating and things like that. We're also working to protect and conserve that bat habitat, so forests and caves and even things like old barns that might have bat colonies in it. We're really working together to try to figure out what's really important for bats and how can we protect it and provide them with the best opportunity to be healthy when they go into hibernation so that maybe they can survive the disease. And just want to wrap up and let you know there's a lot of stuff you can do as students to help out with bat conservation. The first thing, and you guys are already doing this today, is to educate yourself, and maybe you can talk to others about bats. Talk to your other classmates, to your parents, to your friends about bats and why they're so important. You can also provide safe roosting habitat for bats. You can either make a bat house or buy a bat house. There's lots of plans online if you want to make a bat house. If you see bats in your area, so if you know that there's a bat colony in the attic of an old house in your neighborhood or something like that, you should contact your local wildlife agency and let them know about it so that they can make sure that they know that those bats are there and study them. And then if you do see bats doing weird stuff like flying in the daytime or roosting in the sunlight on the outside of a building, you should also contact your local state wildlife agency. You should never touch a bat. If you see a bat and it's behaving oddly or something like that, you should always go find an adult. If you're going to explore caves, you should also just check and make sure that those caves are open, especially in the winter. If there's hibernating bats there, they might be closed for the winter so that you don't disturb those bats. And if you're going to go in caves and mines, you should learn about decontamination so that you don't accidentally spread that fungus from your shoes from one cave to another. A lot of scout troops and church groups and things like that oftentimes visit caves. So if you're going to go on a cave visit, you should look into how you might decontaminate your gear, your shoes and stuff after your visit, and that information is available online. And like I said before, don't ever touch a bat. Bats can carry a disease called rabies that people can get, and if you get bitten or scratched by a bat, the only way we can tell if that bat is sick is that we have to put the bat to sleep and test it for the disease. So if you do see a bat, it's always really important that you go find an adult. And I think the most important thing you guys can do is teach other people to care about bats. And that's my presentation. So I'm going to have time for some questions here. I will go back. I see there's a couple in the chat already and make sure I didn't miss anything earlier. Okay, so SH asked about bats tending to return to the same location. I touched on that briefly. Yeah, they do like to go back to the same caves and mines that they hibernate in. If they use a bat house, they oftentimes will return to that bat house year after year. So once they find a really good spot, they do like to return to that spot. One thing I didn't talk about is that bats can live for a really long time. So we've documented bats in the wild living up to almost I think 41 years is the oldest one that we know about. So bats could be coming back year after year after year to the same place. Let's see. EHS2T, you asked about how do you make a bat house more desirable? That's a really great question. And like I said before, bats like, when they find a good spot, they like to go back to it. And sometimes they're not always like exploring, looking for a new spot. So sometimes it is hard to get bats attracted to a bat house. There's some really good information online. There's an organization called Bat Conservation International, and they have a website that's all about bat houses, a web page all about bat houses, and it talks a little bit about how high up you should put it and how much sunlight it should get and things like that. So that's a really great start and how much sunlight it should get and things like that. So that's a really great start to find out about how you might make a bat house more desirable for bats. So SH, have you traveled outside of the US to do more research? Yeah, I've actually have been really lucky and I've gotten to do research in Canada. I've gotten to do research in Baja, Mexico, and I've gotten to do research in Belize. So that's really cool because I get to see lots of different kinds of bats than the bats that I work with here in the US. Some of the bigger fruit-eating bats and things like that. Yeah, it's a really cool thing to go to different countries and learn about the different bats that they have there. Okay. Mary Elena says, how can I raise awareness about bats not being as harmful as depicted on TV? Okay, well, that's a really great one, and that's kind of tough because there's a lot of myths out there about bats. Like, people always think, oh, bats get in your hair, and you know, people say stuff about all bats are dirty and carry disease. I think it's sometimes it's kind of hard because people already have this fear or have this feeling that they don't like bats. So I think just talking about like how bats are really important, and you know, you might not talk somebody into thinking that they're really cute creatures, but you know, they're really important for our environment and our economy. And you know, you can always provide them with some factual information. Bats actually don't want to have anything to do with our hair. They don't need our hair. They don't build nests or anything. They've got their own hair. But they actually can echolocate something as fine as one human hair. So they're not trying to get in your hair. Only about 0.5% of bats have carry the disease rabies. A lot of times people think, oh, all bats have rabies. It's really rare that bats have rabies. So, you know, just trying to help people understand what the facts are instead of just being reacting to myths and things like that. Okay, let's see. Enviro S, you said you've been in caves. Do you have a favorite fun cave story and a scary cave story? Yeah. Okay, let's see. I've been in a lot of caves, and I love caves. They're just really beautiful, interesting places. Not a lot of people get to see, so if you are interested in caves, I would definitely recommend trying to find out about caves that you could visit in your area. Probably my favorite fun cave story. I got to go to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, and I got to take my nephews there. My nephew are 10, and we got to go on a wild cave tour. So we were actually crawling around, and we got to see some bats, and we got to see some other cave critters like crickets and moths and things like that. And it was a really fun experience for me to get to take my nephew to the cave and learn more about the wildlife that lives there. Probably my favorite scary cave story. It's kind of scary, but it's also kind of fun. I had to go in a cave in Mexico, and it had this really skinny little tube that I couldn't stand up, and I had to crawl on my belly through this long stretch to get to the other side where I knew that there were some bats. And I was crawling down on my belly, and all of a sudden there were all these cockroaches in the cave, and they were crawling all over the place. And I didn't really like that part, and actually, you know, had to go through the cockroaches. But when I got to the end and it opened up into this room, there were actually mom bats with babies in there, so I got to see baby bats, which made it really cool and fun, even though I had to go through this part that made me feel a little bit scary and uncomfortable. Okay, if bats were to disappear, would this lead to an unchanging shift in the ecosystem? Let's see. Well, you know, I think it's really hard for us to understand, like, long term what might happen if bats disappear. We probably won't lose all the bat diversity. You might remember that I said, like, with this disease, it's affecting the hibernating bats, but not the migrating bats. So we might lose some species out of an ecosystem. So we don't really understand exactly what would happen. Would more of the other kind of bats come there because there's more food resources now? Or what other kind of impacts could it be? You know, would the insect populations cause more damage to the native plants? So those are all things that we don't have a really good understanding about. We can only kind of speculate about what might happen, but we do know they're a really important part of the ecosystem. And anytime you remove of an important part of the ecosystem, it always has impacts that you can't really describe before that thing is gone. So what we really hope is that we can get to a place where we're not losing all those bats, so that we don't have to figure out what those impacts are going to be. Okay, do bats have nipples? Sorry, not trying to be funny, I just really want to know. Well, hey, that's a really great question, actually. And like I said at the beginning, bats are mammals. So just like humans, they have to feed their young, and they nurse them on milk when they're babies, just like baby humans. And so yes, bats do have nipples. And actually, funny enough, sometimes bats have nipples in a kind of funny place, and that's actually in their armpit, because they have wings. Sometimes you'll see a mom nursing a baby, and then the baby will be kind of tucked in their armpit, and then the mom bat has their wing wrapped around them. It's actually pretty cool to see that. And when we're researching bats and we're catching them out on the landscape, especially the time of year that there might be baby bats, that's one way we can tell if the bat has young, is by looking to see if their nipples are sort of enlarged. So when they're breastfeeding, when they're giving their baby milk, their nipples get a little bit bigger. And so when we catch a bat during that time of year, we can actually look and see. And if their nipple's a little bit enlarged, we know that that is a mom bat that probably has young back at home. And we'll try to get those bats out of our hand and back into the wild as quickly as we can, so we're not additionally stressing them out. Okay, are there any species of bats that can eat or drink blood, fruit, and bugs, and not just one? That's also a really great question. For the most part, bats are either one thing or the other, although there are a couple of bats that have been observed doing two different things. So like, for example, one of my favorite bats, it's called a pallid bat. They do live here in the US. Pallid bats eat insects most of the time. Actually, they're pretty darn cool bats. They eat stuff like scorpions and centipedes, and they're just kind of like really cool bats. But one really cool thing about them is that they've actually been observed also eating pollen at different times of year when the cactus are blooming. So they're taking advantage of that other food resource, which is really kind of unique for a lot of bat species, but I think just something that makes them extra especially cool. Okay. How far south can bats migrate? That's a good question, and one I don't necessarily know the exact answer to. So I do know some bats in the US will travel from places like Texas all the way down to Brazil in South America. So that's a pretty long distance. So that's a great question, and one I'd have to look up a little bit more, but they can migrate pretty far distance. Okay, so do the bats only eat flying insects? Cockroaches seem like a hefty meal. If you're talking about my my cave story with the cockroaches, I don't think that the bats were necessarily eating those cockroaches, although there are some cockroaches that fly, and I'm sure that there are some bats that might eat things like cockroaches. You'd be surprised at the size of some of the stuff they eat. They're really, really amazing predators, and watching bats flying and catching insects is so cool, how they do it, and just, you know, they can catch an insect in midair and eat it in the air, or they might take it back to a place where they can roost and sort of eat it while they're hanging upside down. So they might have to take something a little bit bigger somewhere to eat it instead of just eating it while they're flying along. Okay, let's see. Will we ever be able to turn white nose syndrome into a benign disease? So, you know, there's, I think what we probably hope is that through the course of us having a better understanding of the disease, we might be able to develop treatments like maybe even vaccines or similar that can help bats resist the fungus that causes the disease. Good news I didn't talk about before is that there are some small populations of bats that seem to be living in places where the disease is killing other bats. So we don't really understand that fully yet, and it's something we're really interested in learning more about. But there may be some bats that just aren't affected as much by the disease, and perhaps those bats will be able to survive that disease and reproduce, and their young will also be able to survive. Because bats are have really long lives, and they only usually have one baby a year, they aren't going to be able to reproduce really quickly to get back to the population levels that there were before the disease. So we may be left with these smaller groups of bats that are able to resist the disease, but they're not, we're not ever going to be able to completely get rid of the disease unless we can figure out some treatment options or ways that we can combat the fungus in the cave environment. Okay, let's see. I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. So SH asks, do bats tend to be affectionate animals? Bats are really social animals, a lot of them. They have, some bats live in really big colonies. For example, Mexican free-tailed bats in Texas, there's a cave that has something like 10 million bats in it. And they're all really close together. They like to kind of be really packed in really tight because it keeps it really warm in there. They groom each other, they groom their young, so they have social relationships. I don't know, I think that they are affectionate is a word that we would use about humans. I would say bat mothers care for their young. They're really good mothers. They provide a lot of high level of care. A bat mom can go out and hunt and then come back into a cave with millions of bats and find their own baby. I think that's pretty unique. So I think that they do have a lot of cool social relationships and interactions, and they do provide a lot of care for their young and things like that. Let's see. If you have a bat in your attack, do you have to worry about the guano? Let's see. I guess I don't really understand the question. Bat guano, so the guano is the word that we call bat droppings. So bat poop is called bat guano. Oh, attic. Great. Okay, no problem. I was just going to talk about that too. So good you pointed that out. So bat guano, along with lots of other animal guano, can sometimes have fungus that grows on it or have things that can cause human disease. So if you do have, let's say you had some bats living in your attic, if you had a lot of bats living in your attic and you had a lot of guano, there are some concerns that it could cause some human health problems. So you don't want to get in the guano and get it stirred up, and it has the possibility that if you inhaled some of the dust particles, you could get sick from the stuff that might be growing on the guano. So there are places that can help with cleaning up guano if you have guano in your house or in your attic or something like that, or if you go in a barn and you see a big pile of bat guano. Bat guano looks kind of like mouse turds. It's really tiny, almost like a grain of rice size, and it's really dark colored. So if you saw a pile of something like that, I would definitely make sure you go get an adult and don't step in it or pick it up or anything like that, because you could, whether it's bat guano or from other animals, you could potentially get sick from it. So yeah, it's a good thing to be aware of. If you have a small number of bats living in your attic or your barn, it's probably not going to be enough guano to be worried about, but if there's a lot of it, you might consider contacting somebody to help clean it up and make sure that everyone is safe. Okay, do you know about any agencies or organizations that help bats or educate people about bats? Yeah, there's actually a couple of really great organizations. I mentioned one earlier called Bat Conservation International. They have a really great website. It's got sections about education. It's got sections about if you want to build bat houses and things like that. That's probably the biggest one. There's also a couple of other organizations. There's Bat World. There is the Save Lucy Foundation and Ruby in Florida. So there's quite a few bat organizations, but I'd probably start out with Bat Conservation International. just because they've probably got the most information about bats worldwide. And also your state wildlife agencies or Fish and Wildlife Service, other organizations probably have more specialized information about bats in your area. So that's a good way if you wanted to learn about the bats where you live. I'm not sure where everybody's from. That might be cool if you guys want to tell me where you're from. You know, I live in Washington State. There's an organization here called Bats Northwest, and our state agency, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, has some great information about the bats here in Washington. So that's where I'd start. Oh, hey, another person from Washington. Hello. What's my favorite bat? Oh, that's always a really hard question. There's so many bats that I love that it's hard for me to pick just one. I think I talked about one of my favorite bats a little bit earlier, the pallid bat. That's a really cool bat. The other bat that I'm really interested in and I haven't gotten a chance to see yet, but I hope I get to see someday, is the spotted bat. They actually live here in the US, but they're really rare and they're really, really cute, I think. They have black fur with 3 big white polka dots on their back, and they have these huge pink ears. And I just think they're a really attractive looking bat, and I would really love to be able to see one in person. We've got a few more minutes. If anybody has any other questions, don't be shy. I see somebody's typing, so we've got at least one more question coming. Must be a really good question. While you're typing, I'll tell you about one of the other bats I think is really cool. There's actually, I think I mentioned earlier, a bat that eats meat. They eat fish and frogs, and I actually got to watch these fishing bats when I was in Puerto Rico one time, and they're really cool. They fly along and they echolocate little fish right around the surface of the water, and they have really big feet, and then they fly down and they scoop them up in their back feet and put them in their mouth and eat them. That's really neat. But they do kind of smell a little bit fishy when you catch them. Okay, would you recommend a career in a government position? So do you like working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? I love working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We get to do so much really important and amazing stuff to help our wildlife and habitats around the U.S. So birds and bats and snakes and frogs and lots of other mammals, you know, that's really cool. Bears and wolves and foxes and things like that. And I get to work with a lot of really passionate people that really care about our environment and about our wildlife resources. So that's really cool to get to work with a lot of people that are really smart and really interested in making our world a better place. So I think that's really cool. I do like working for the government. I think it's a really good opportunity to serve your country in a different way and you know, try to leave a legacy of leaving a place that's a little bit better, maybe for the next generation of people, whether it's my nephew or you know, my friends' children or whoever, that they get to experience all this amazing wildlife and all these cool places that we have here in the United States. So I really like working for the government, and I really love working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I've also worked for the National Park Service in my career, And that's really cool too, to get to work in our national parks and these really beautiful places that people like to go visit and go hiking and camping and learning about our natural and cultural history. So I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities if you like the environment and the outdoors and our wildlife and fish and things like that, to work in government agencies to protect those things. I see a couple more questions coming, it looks like. You're welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Where are you all from? Oh, cool. All right. So I talk with your teachers. Well, I'm really happy that I got to talk with you all today. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope that maybe at the end of the talk today, everybody feels like bats are really cool, and hopefully you can go talk somebody else into thinking they're cool too, if they didn't before. So thanks so much. Yay, I'm glad to hear you think they're cool too. You can see all my bat stuff behind me. I'm kind of obsessed with them because they're so cool. All right. Well, I guess we're at the end of the time. So thanks again, and hopefully I'll talk to some of you all again. Take care.